Okay.
Okay, and we're ready to go.
All right. Hello. I'm going to speak about the Tarpon Springs Greektown Traditional Cultural Property Historic District. On June 2nd, 2014, the National Park Service added the Tarpon Springs Greektown Historic District to the National Register of Historic Places. This was Florida's first traditional cultural property listing, or TCP, and the nation's first non-Native American, Indian, or Hawaiian TCP Historic District. As such, it is a template for the state and the nation. Greektown is significant for its tenacious continuity of traditional culture, extensive Greek infrastructure, and as the only Greek American community based on the sponge industry. Today, I will explore the definition and history of TCPs, the Greektown District, the creation of the NR nomination, and identifying or evaluating TCPs in your community. So what are traditional cultural properties? The National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 failed to provide clear coverage for the full range of cultural resources. Historic properties were the sole type specified. Intangible culture was outside its scope. Congress's 1980 Act amendments included a directive to study the means of preserving and conserving the intangible elements of our cultural heritage, such as arts, skills, folk life, and folk ways, and to recommend ways to preserve, conserve, and encourage the continuation of the diverse traditional, that is prehistoric, historic, ethnic, and folk cultural traditions that underlie and are a living expression of our American heritage. In response to the directive, Florida folklorist Orman Loomis prepared the report Cultural Conservation. Presented to Congress in 1983 by the National Park Service and Library of Congress, it recommended that traditional cultural resources, whether associated with historic properties or without property reference, be more systematically addressed in implementation of the Act and other historic preservation authorities. In the late 1980s, National Register Bulletin number 38, Guidelines for Evaluating and Documenting Traditional Cultural Properties, was prepared in response to the Cultural Conservation Report. Its purpose was to assist in determining whether properties thought to have traditional cultural significance are eligible for NR inclusion, and to help historic preservation agencies and practitioners who evaluate these properties. Bulletin 38 defined a TCP as eligible because of its, quote, association with cultural practices or beliefs of a living community that are rooted in that community's history and important in maintaining the continuing cultural identity of the community, end quote. Examples include locations associated with traditional beliefs of a Native American group about its origins, cultural history, or the nature of the world. Rural communities whose organization, buildings, and structures or patterns of land use reflect the cultural traditions valued by its long-term residents. Urban neighborhoods that are the traditional home of a particular cultural group and that reflect its beliefs, customs, and practices. Locations where Native American religious practitioners have historically gone and are known or thought to go today, or perform ceremonial activities in accordance with traditional cultural rules of practice, and locations where a community has traditionally carried out economic, artistic, or other cultural practices important in maintaining its historical identity. TCPs are not a separate and distinct type of NR property, but are, quote, an overlay of traditional cultural significance that may be associated with a property otherwise listed in or eligible for listing in the NR, unquote, such as a building, structure, district, object, or site. In addition, TCPs must maintain a continuity of cultural association or use into the present, though the NR acknowledges that traditional cultural significance and use may evolve and change over time. An important assumption underlying Bulletin 38 is that there is a naturally dynamic relationship between tangible and intangible traditional cultural resources, and the beliefs or practices associated with the traditional cultural property are of central importance in defining its significance. Bulletin 38 also notes that TCPs are often hard to recognize and may not be revealed through archaeological, historical, or architectural surveys. Thus, it recommends interviews and other types of ethnographic research by cultural anthropologists or folklorists. In practice, the majority of NR-listed TCPs have been Native American sacred sites, yet Bulletin 38 states, Americans of every ethnic origin have properties to which they ascribe traditional cultural value, and if such properties meet the National Register criteria, they can and should be nominated for inclusion in the register. In 2016, the NPS issued a call to modernize historic preservation methods and technologies, show how historic structures can be made sustainable, and support efforts to rebuild the economic vitality of rural and urban communities. It conducted a review and update of Bulletin 38, and in April 2012, it began soliciting nationwide input and dialogue. It also began actively encouraging the nomination of more non-Native American TCPs. One more point about TCPs and why they are important. TCPs represent what folklorist and historic preservationist Laurie Summers calls an integrative approach to preserving not just buildings, but places in a holistic sense. By combining historic preservation methods and ethnographic research that includes interviews, audio, video recordings, field notes, etc., the TCP approach integrates people, traditions, and use with buildings and landscapes, producing a more profound understanding of the significance of place. TCPs also resonate with historic preservationist Kingston Heath's humanistic approach. He believes that, quote, buildings and settings alone do not make place. People in their interrelationship with the natural and built environments make place, unquote. And these places matter because they are meaningful to the people who use them. Yet too often, preservation efforts seem to lack an awareness that buildings in historic districts have no essential significance if reduced to house types or aesthetically pleasing areas. Buildings do not in themselves possess significance. They are attributed significance by people. People don't exist to build house types. They use houses to share lives made rich through music, ritual, food, language, art, and most importantly, social relationships with other people. In the early 20th century, Greek immigrants significantly expanded and changed Florida's sponge industry. In Greece, sponge diving crews learned about opportunities in Tarpon Springs, Florida. In 1905, about 500 men arrived. Within a couple years, there were 100 sponge boats and 1,000 Greeks working Florida waters, and many others in related maritime businesses. In 1908, they founded the Sponge Exchange, a cooperative warehouse processing center and auction site. Using both deep sea diving and hooking techniques on boats with sails and engines, the Greeks revolutionized the sponge business. Tarpon Springs became the largest US sponge port, and sponges were Florida's most lucrative sea product. Greeks continued to settle in Tarpon Springs throughout the 20th century, seeking better opportunities in a difficult industry and fleeing political problems at home. At first, they arrived alone, and they lived on boats, in boarding houses, or in tiny shacks near the sponge docks. As their families arrived, they moved into the fish house area south of the sponge docks. The influx changed Tarpon Springs forever. Since the 1880s, the town had been dominated by wealthy Northerners. Then the Greeks established Greektown with residences, stores, churches, restaurants, coffee houses, and recreational facilities that gradually stretched from the sponge docks to the city center. By 1913, as many as half of Tarpon residents were Greek. Signs at the railroad station were printed in English and Greek, and many businesses displayed both Greek and American flags. The sponge trade grew steadily through the 1920s. Tarpon Springs was buoyed by the success of the spongers through the Florida land boom collapse in 1926 and the Great Depression. The ethnic character of Tarpon Springs coincided with the development of mass tourism in the early 20th century, so businesses based on cultural tourism developed early. To outsiders, Greek culture and sponges dominated the town's reputation. Internally, the Greeks gradually began to control municipal politics as the majority, or by allying themselves with African Americans, many of whom developed close friendships with them through work on their boats and in the warehouses, and often learned to speak Greek. From 1905 to 1940, Greeks constituted the numerically dominant cultural group. Historian Charlie Moskos wrote, quote, "With the thriving sponge industry as its basis, Tarpon Springs became more than a Greek town enclave. It became a Greek town, in fact." From 1905 into World War II, Tarpon Springs had a majority Greek population, a situation without parallel in any other town in the United States. In 1940, there were 1,000 men engaged in the sponge industry who, with their family, constituted about 2,500 Greek Americans in the town's total population of 3,400. Interestingly, but not unpredictably, numerous scholars later documented these population figures, but local histories written by Anglo-Americans focused primarily on the Anglo-American, not the Greek or the African-American history of the town. Since Greeks arrived in relatively large numbers, they maintained an unusually large portion of their culture. Folklorist Robert Georges wrote, "The Florida climate was comparable to that of their home islands. Because of their numbers, they could continue to speak Greek, practice the Greek Orthodox religion, maintain their family structure, and perpetuate familiar dietary habits and modes of dress. The men engaged in the same occupations as they had in Greece and used the same technology in their work. Theirs was virtually a life transplanted," unquote. Indeed, Greektown was like a village unto itself. Teacher and former Historic Preservation Board member Nicolette SAROUKOS Henderson explained, "My Greektown was a neighborhood of Greek-speaking friends and relatives, bakeries and grocery stores. Everyone knew everyone, and we looked out for each other. There are still a few of the Sponger shacks left in the area. The KAFENEION still attracts Greeks of all generations. Many residents now are third and fourth generation Greek Americans who choose to live in ancestral homes or are returning to their roots," unquote. With the onset of World War II and closure of the European sponge market, the supply of sponges decreased while the demand increased. Tarpon Springs became the world's leading sponge producing center. Yet looming underneath the prosperity of a major international business was economic disaster. In the 1930s, a sponge disease spread north in the Caribbean and Atlantic, destroying the Bahamian, Cuban, and other Caribbean sponge beds. By 1948, it had devastated the Florida beds. Mediterranean sponges flooded the market, and DuPont introduced cheap synthetic sponges. From 1947 to 1957, the sponge business nearly collapsed, and many families left for jobs in the northern steel mills. By the time the beds recovered, most spongers and their children had entered more secure occupations. Tarpon Springs survived by switching its economic focus. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, tourism edged out sponges to become the primary economic base. In 1948 and 1953, two commercial films, 16 Fathoms Deep and Beneath the 12-Mile Reef, assisted by popularizing romantic ideas about sponging and publicizing Tarpon Springs. Additionally, Epiphany ceremonies gained national attention and drew thousands. By the late 1970s, only 1/3 of residents were Greek or of Greek descent in a town of about 13,000. Sponge fishing continued on a limited basis until the 1980s. Due to catastrophic sponge mortalities in the Eastern Mediterranean in 1986, there was a major revival of the industry in Tarpon Springs with about 40 working boats. By 1996, however, due to pollution and other causes, it decreased to 8 to 10 boats working, plus a few others working periodically. Pause.
Started.
Today, the Greektown district, measuring 140 acres and with 296 contributing sites, buildings, and structures, including sponge boats, preserves a strong ethnic and maritime character and a population and culture that have remained remarkably stable for more than a century. Greek is still widely spoken in the district and remains the primary language in many homes. There is also some Greek signage. According to Pinellas County records, over 76% of Greektown properties are currently owned by Greeks, though residents estimate that into the early 1980s, up to 98% of residents were Greek. But over the years, many of them have moved to other parts of town. Some major Greek cities have larger Greek populations, but none has a greater percentage of residents with Greek heritage. Greektown is also the epicenter of a 40-mile corridor with a large ethnic population, which was generated as Tarpon Springs Greeks spread outside the city and were joined by many other Greeks and Greek Americans. Tourism, still Tarpon Springs' economic engine, remains primarily cultural tourism, focusing on Greek heritage and the sponge trade. It is centered in Greektown, especially DODECANESE Boulevard with the sponge docks, former sponge exchange, residents, and touristic shops and boat cruises. In addition, some businesses cater primarily to locals, such as Athens streets, Greek markets, bakeries, and traditional kafeneia, or coffee houses, where men imbibe coffee and spirits, play cards, smoke, and discuss politics or sports. On DODECANESE Boulevard, one store sells Greek music, books, and children's games. Despite the tourists, many residents maintain such a strong sense of group cohesion that it is difficult for non-Greeks to penetrate. Greek identity is expressed and reinforced through an array of everyday activities and special events that are part of the traditional culture. It is reflected not only in the built environment and boats, but also such intangible cultural expressions as occupations, music and dance, social organization, rites of passage, beliefs, family values, foodways, sacred and secular events, and religious practices. Tarpon Springs also provides important cultural resources to the state and region, such as Greek baked goods and wholesale food businesses, the annual Epiphany celebration, or musical groups. Can we pause again?
All right, it started.
I'm going to show you some slides, and I want you to note that with the slides, I'm showing you about traditional culture in Tarpon Springs. I'm including addresses. These are used as examples of the intangible cultural heritage associated with certain sites, and many of these were used as part of the National Register nomination that was submitted. But here, we have examples of events such as Easter, things happening at certain locations and houses as part of traditional culture, the church ceremonies, of course, Greek Independence Day, the sponge industry, the boats, processing the sponges, the sponge docks, again, sponge warehouses, boat builder, examples of music associated with New Year's, traditional culture going on in homes, boats. Again, this is a community event, and this is an annual event. Okay, so as the commercial and residential center of the Greek community, Greektown is significant under the NR's Criterion A, a property associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of history, and its areas of significance are ethnic heritage, European, Greek, and maritime history. Since residents have maintained considerable Greek and maritime culture, its period of significance stretches from 1905 to the present. In addition, the district not only fulfills TCP criteria for an urban neighborhood that is the traditional home of a particular cultural group and that reflects its values and practices, but also provides an exceptionally clear model for a TCP district. I'm now going to discuss the National Register nomination process because it was a little different for a TCP. Before settling in Tarpon Springs, I worked as a folklorist for History Miami and then for the Florida Folklife Program, which was in Florida's Bureau of Historic Preservation. Positions that armed me with knowledge about diverse traditional communities throughout Florida. And for general information, Florida is defined in the Florida state statutes as part of historical resources. Specifically, quote, folklife means the traditional expressive culture shared within the various groups in Florida, familial, ethnic, occupational, religious, and regional. Expressive culture includes a wide range of creative and symbolic forms such as custom, belief, technical skill, language, literature, art, architecture, music, play, drama, dance, ritual, pageantry, and handicraft, which forms are generally learned orally, by imitation, are in performance, and are maintained or perpetuated without formal instruction or institutional direction, unquote. But after 13 years working for the state, I feared that our efforts had had a limited impact on Florida's 24 million people. So when a job with the city of Tarpon Springs opened, I saw the potential to have a more profound impact on sustaining community culture because of the smaller size. Moreover, it was a position in which many of my skills and areas of expertise converged: public folklife, ethnography, historic preservation, Greek culture, and ongoing research into Tarpon Springs' sponge industry, as well as the sponge industries of Miami, Greece, Cuba, and the Bahamas. I envisioned a multi-pronged approach to cultural sustainability using public folklore and historic preservation. Beginning in 2011, American Folklore Society members formed a working group on folklore in historic preservation policy to better position us and folklore methodologies in the historic preservation field. At the 2012 meeting, I became aware that the NR was seeking non-Native American TCP nominations to serve as national models. I immediately recognized that Greektown, more than any other traditional community in Florida, would provide an excellent template for a district whose significance was based on traditional culture. While at the Bureau of Historic Preservation, I worked closely with State Historic Preservation Officer Barbara Maddock on several policies, including the NR nomination of Eatonville around 1998. Though that nomination was based, as we wrote it, on both historical and traditional cultural significance, it was ultimately listed only for historical significance. But as a result of our efforts, Maddock understood both folklife and Bulletin 38 and saw the TCP nomination of Greektown as an important step forward for state historic preservation. In Tarpon Springs, I broached the idea of a TCP district to city staff in January 2013. It was greeted with skepticism. The Victorian downtown had been listed on the NR since the 1990s, but not Greektown, even though it was the most significant district because it is unique in the nation, in part because city staff believed that the Greeks would not agree to historic building code restrictions. In fact, a second survey by a hired historic preservation specialist, which was intended to lay the groundwork for another district, focused on a far less distinctive area. During the Greektown nomination process, I frequently consulted with Maddock and also with the NR's Paul Lusignan about how to document traditional culture using an application oriented to building style. For instance, question number 7, description, calls for architectural classification and materials. Information about intangible activities thus had to be correlated with specifics about style and date for every contributing resource. But there was no real model for an extensive TCP district. Previously, there had been only 5 single or multiple property nominations on the NR. In some instances, thus, we were hammering out the appropriate response for the first time. I had to determine, for the nomination, district boundaries, document the continuity of traditional culture, and relate the culture to practices at specific sites in a residential and commercial district with over 400 resources. So I formed a local working group of residents to pinpoint current boundaries. Several walked the entire district with me, describing its history, movement of people within it, boundary changes, lives of residents, and structures that had vanished. They even identified a building type previously unknown outside the district. These were the tiny divers' cottages, known locally as skilas bitia, or dog houses, because they lacked plumbing. The men spent all of their time on the boats or at the coffee houses, so they didn't need such amenities. The information from the working group was essential to the process, leading to the inclusion of areas with continuity of use and excluding those that no longer functioned as part of the district. For example, there was a neighborhood near the church that had been occupied by families from the island of Simi. It was not included in the nomination because the Simian families had relocated and most residents were not Greek. In contrast, the Mears SAROUKOS sponge packing house retains significance despite modifications and current use by a bridge painting company. This relies on the understanding that cultural significance is dynamic and changing, and that the predominantly Greek-owned bridge painting company has largely replaced the sponge business by employing local Greek men while maintaining many occupational patterns evident in the sponge business, like the going away for work and the danger of the business and so on. By this time, I had lived and worked in the district for 4 years, documenting its history, culture, specific individuals, and places where cultural phenomena occurred. This included photographic, audio, video, and textual documentation via notes of community-based events such as Epiphany, Orthodox Easter, Saints' Days, and other religious phenomena, social dances, musical performances, foodways, rites of passage such as funerals or baptism, Greek Independence Day, and many other occasions. So I wrote a short ethnography, provided visual documentation, and related the narrative and images to particular sites. As per the NR, I provided minimal information about standard building styles since the TCP was not architecturally based. However, I examined vernacular architecture with emphasis on culturally specific adaptations, for example, the sponge warehouses and St. Michael's Shrine, as well as sponge boat characteristics. Having visited many homes and businesses over the years, I knew the range of existing cultural phenomena. But per NR guidelines, I needed to establish that at least 70% of residents practice traditional culture. We all agreed that with hundreds of structures and owners, it was impossible to visit each one. Instead, based on ethnographic research, we assumed that most Greek residents engaged in some form of traditional culture. The easiest way to determine ownership, and thus often residence, was through county property records, which, as I mentioned, revealed that 76% were Greek-owned. I combined these records with verbal and visual information to determine whether structures were contributing or non-contributing. A contributing resource adds to the district, and in this case, the cultural significance of the property. Shippo-Matic worked closely with me to ensure that the nomination fulfilled state and national requirements. Through numerous conversations over several months, we agreed upon information to be included and the processes used to arrive at that information. I established the district map and geographical coordinates and provided this information to the Bureau of Historic Preservation. They created a CAD map that located each contributing resource. In December 2013, I made presentations to members of the district first, then the City Historic Preservation Board and city commissioners, and all approved the nomination. A crucial element was the agreement that property owners would not be subject to municipal historic building codes because the district was nominated on the basis of its constantly evolving traditional culture rather than on historic buildings. In February, I drove to Tallahassee for the Florida NR Review Board meeting. Several of the Bureau staff interested in learning about TCPs attended the review. Also, Paul Lothar from the NR attended by phone. The board's reaction was favorable and the district was deemed eligible. While NR listing does not provide much protection, once a nomination is deemed eligible, proposed changes involving federal money, permits, or actions must go through a Section 106 review to determine negative impacts. Thus, being listed as a TCP provides a short-term level of protection against threats to the integrity of the district if they involve the federal government or federal money. This played a crucial role very quickly in defeating city plans to gentrify the Sponge Docks working waterfront shortly after Greektown was deemed eligible, when a permit to modify it was denied by the Bureau of Historic Preservation's Compliance and Review Director who had attended the HR review. And these are the plans, which, as you can see, actually look nothing like the working Sponge Docks, or very little like it. So what can you do to determine whether you might have an eligible TCP? Here are some steps that you may have already deduced during my description of the Greektown nomination. First, review what constitutes a TCP and think about your town. I grew up in Placentia in Orange County, California in the 1960s. And back then it was mostly orange and avocado groves, chicken farms, and a tiny, predominantly Mexican downtown. Now, the agricultural businesses or the Mexican cultural complex would have been considered basis for a TCP in that case. Another thing that you can do is hire a specialist. Bulletin 38 acknowledges that TCPs may be hard to recognize or reveal through archaeological, historical, or architectural surveys. It recommends ethnographic research by cultural anthropologists or folklorists. This was my experience in Tarpon Springs. And at the Florida Folklife program, when I hired researchers to survey traditional architecture for the state, the only one who is an architectural specialist and not a folklorist and ethnographer was not as well equipped to handle the identification, documentation, and description of traditional culture. So if you might have a TCP, but you have no ethnographic training, I suggest hiring an anthropologist or folklorist for an initial evaluation. If the result is positive, they can then proceed to conduct an ethnographic survey and help write the nomination. And finally, very importantly, you should involve community stakeholders and make the process collaborative. The community will be invaluable in gaining support and supplying details and history that you will not find elsewhere. And this may be very important in determining what to nominate and what to include in the nomination. Collaboration may also create rapport with communities that are sometimes alienated from city government, and this could have long-term positive effects. Now, an NR listing does not effectively protect historical or cultural properties, but the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, can. And I'd like to talk a little bit about CEQA and mitigating adverse effects, potential effects to TCPs. CEQA defines historical resources as part of the environment, and thus changes caused by a non-exempt project are subject to review. It requires state and local public lead agencies to identify environmental impacts of discretionary projects to determine if there will be significant adverse impacts. If there are, projects must identify possible alternatives or mitigation measures to substantially reduce negative environmental impacts. This may involve redesigning a project. Within the context of CEQA and using the Greektown Historic District, TCP, as a model, I want to give you a few examples of potentially adverse effects that might result from ill-considered projects. First, I already briefly mentioned what was undoubtedly the biggest threat to the Greektown District, the city's proposed redevelopment of the sponge docks, which was defeated in part by the need for a Section 106 review before receiving a needed permit. I'm going to tell you a little more about it. Beginning with a meeting in 2010, and this is what you're looking at is an invitation to that meeting, which you can tell they already had an idea of what they wanted to do. And culminating with final plans revealed in 2013, at the time I was writing the NR nomination, there was a city project to upgrade the sponge docks area. Unfortunately, in the middle of the relatively small working sponge docks, the architect planned large areas of landscaping that were dedicated to tourist strolls and an ancient Greek-inspired amphitheater, which was to feature Greek dance or music, performances, lectures, or sponge fishermen demonstrating their work, even though sponge fishermen already work on the docks in a natural context. To offset lost workspace, an 8-foot wooden dock was to be built into the narrow Anclote River. Previously, townspeople had vetoed plans for a small sponge diving themed playground and splash fountain on the docks, where spongers regularly drive their trucks to load supplies and unload, clean and sort sponges. These plans were based on several problematic and faulty assumptions. First, plans should privilege tourist and merchant interests over those of the sponge fishermen or other Greek community members. Second, Greek culture and the sponge industry were dead or dying. Third, stage programs would better represent Greek culture than daily life. And fourth, Greeks could not agree on anything, so opposition would eventually die. Moreover, the plans would have made the work of the sponge fishermen more difficult. The narrowed channel would make it harder for boats to maneuver. The wooden dock extension would require constant city upkeep, and its nails would catch on the netted bags of sponges dragged over its surface by the fishermen. It would be impossible to continue several important events in the Greek community due to insufficient room. And the modernist design was inconsistent with the area's historical character. However, as soon as the Greektown district was deemed eligible, the head of, as I mentioned, BHP's Compliance and Review section determined that the map provided by the city to the Army Corps of Engineers for a permit to build the dock extension did not reflect recent dock extensions built across the river, which had already limited navigation. On the basis of endangering traditional sponge fishing and narrowing the waterway, he informed the Army Corps that his office would not approve the permit request without a Section 106 review. Back in Tarpon Springs, Greek community opposition to the plans grew, and city commissioners changed their position, saying they were bowing to the will of the people to preserve the docks. But they never mentioned that they had not received the necessary permit. So the actual mitigation in this problematic project was that the city decided, even though they'd already spent about $100,000 of the money on the plans, they decided to then hold meetings with the Greek town residents to ask what kinds of improvements they wanted. The other meetings had been open to the general population of Tarpon and were not, predominantly the Greek town residents. Most of the suggestions of the residents included sidewalks, lighting, and such practical issues, and the city used the remaining funds to make these improvements. Okay, now another problematic project in relation to the Greektown district might be if citywide design guidelines were instituted that would prohibit residents from making home modifications customary in local Greek American culture, such as statuary, columns, other Greek symbols, or landscaping. And as you can see here on these vernacular houses, all of them are fitted with Greek columns. So a potential mitigation for this problem well, no doubt the best approach would be to avoid the need for mitigation in this and similar cases by studying the potential impact on a TCP before approving the new regulations. But another strategy might be to declare TCPs as exempt from citywide design regulations. As I mentioned, in the case of Greektown, the city approved my request that the district need not abide by the strict historic preservation codes, since it is understood that traditional culture changes rather than stays static, thus allowing residents to continue their traditional practices and customs for building design. Another potential problematic project might be zoning changes to land use that would prohibit industrial workshops that have long been part of community culture, such as the LAZARO'S diving helmet workshop or boatyards. This could mean the demise of the last helmet making workshop, and diving helmets are a powerful symbol still, not just of the sponge industry, but of Tarpon Springs itself. And while it is possible to move these business, they would no longer contribute to the cultural integrity of the district if they relocated outside the district. And there are a few other places within the district where they could feasibly move. The same would be true if a proposed zoning amendment would directly or indirectly inhibit the ritual practices associated with Epiphany in Spring Bayou, a central community celebration for more than a century. So a potential mitigation for this, again, before creating a zoning code amendment and concomitant restrictions, it would be best to do a survey to identify local TCPs and then meet with community members to discuss how potential zoning changes might impact their cultural heritage. Discussions with the community are essential since there is not a single finite list of designated items that contribute to cultural heritage, but rather an intuitive and sometimes undocumented assemblage of elements held to be important by the community. And as previously mentioned, one strategy would be to exempt the TCPs from new zoning rules. And just briefly, a couple more examples of potential adverse effects that could be prevented or mitigated in similar ways, or would be if traditional or ritual grave accessories or decorations were forbidden in Cicadia Cemetery. And cemeteries do sometimes prohibit visitors from leaving items on the graves of loved ones. But in this case, it would limit the expression of culture and sometimes ritual practices. And Cicadia Cemetery has been listed on the National Register as a traditional cultural property because of the Greek culture associated with the headstones and the items placed on the graves, and with ritual practices associated with funerals in the graveyard. Another possible problematic area would be to allow McDonald's or similar generic fast food chains to open a franchise on Athens Street in the place of one of the existing traditional coffee houses. This could destroy the cultural integrity of Athens Street, and this is a view of it. It would also attract more tourists and fewer residents, and probably would compromise the atmosphere of the remaining kafenia or coffee houses. And here's some pictures of them. So, in conclusion, as development continues to threaten TCPs, such as working waterfronts, farms, ranches, and other landscapes, and gentrification pushes longtime residents out of urban ethnic neighborhoods, historic preservation and the identification of TCPs can work as important tools to maintain cultural integrity and a sense of place. The end.